I don't know if I should confess to a technical difficulty. These computer programs, come with a little assist, like speaker's notes. And speaker's notes aren't coming up on this, so I'm going to have to do a lot of ad-libbing. But anyway, first of all, I want to welcome you and thank you for coming out to this Humanist Forum. But before I get started, I would like to introduce the members of our planning committee. Now, this is where the list would come in handy so that I can remember. But anyway, we have Stefan, who's at the back. We have a hand. We've got Dylan. Is Dylan here? Shane, Lily. Who else? Who am I missing? Norm Mayer. So anyway, thank you very much, folks. Now, I want to just add, though, we're always interested in getting feedback from members in terms of topics you'd like to see for future sessions, and also, even better news, if someone is prepared to do a session. So if you have any of those aspirations, please contact one of the members of the committee. Now, before I get started, I just want to make a little qualifier here. I don't come in the stance of an expert in any way. I'm just another person who's confused and bewildered about the present world situation, and I say I'm trying to make sense out of what is in many ways a senseless situation. And then secondly, I won't be making many references to sources, but I want you to know that all of the sources have been newspapers, magazines, videos, sources that everyone could have access to. So this is a vast topic, and to deal with it, I've tried to break it down into 5 topics, which, can everyone read the screen from where you are? You're good. I won't go over them, but what I plan to do is to address the first 4 topics now in this session, and after we have a refreshment break, I'll deal with the last topic. Now, the word existential has become almost blasé in our society. There are so many crises that we deal with, and I could have easily added another 15 to that list. But one thing to note is that for these crises, even though they are important, they will hit the world gradually over time. Now, most scientists say that'll be faster than most people realize. And also, they will impact on different parts of the world in different ways. But if it comes to a military crisis, that would hit the world, I put within seconds, but I could say within hours. And just the power of the blast would just decommission communication and cause so many different problems. So if a nuclear weapon were to be used, it would have disastrous and permanent effects. Now, I mentioned in the article that there were 2 things that gave me a special motivation to address this topic. And one was the book by Anne Jacobson. Now, in that book, like I should say first of all, and just remind you what the key ideas were. Anne is a journalist, and she'd interviewed people from several different countries at every level where people had something to do with the military. So she interviewed politicians, generals, and actually the soldiers that are actually handling these nuclear weapons and pull the trigger to launch them. And in that book, she hypothesizes an attack from North Korea that hits the city of Washington and does destructive work. And the first thing that you see happening is a breakdown in communication, a breakdown in the chain of command. And what it really shows is how quickly you'd have total disaster from human error and from technological failure. And these things can all happen. And then the second source was the movie A House of Dynamite. And that addresses a similar theme, but I think it's important for us to realize the House of Dynamite that the author is talking about, that they're presenting in that movie, and by the way, that movie is available on Netflix, and I'd encourage you to watch it. But the House of Dynamite they're talking about is our Earth, and wanting us to realize that we are sitting on this keg of potential world destruction. So it's a pretty frightening thought. So these were some of the things that motivated me to give this talk. Now that's a picture of a thermonuclear blast. And the only reason I put that in there is I want to emphasize that when the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they talked about tons of explosive power. When you talk about a thermonuclear blast, you're talking about millions of tons of power. So it's just almost impossible to imagine how extreme a blast like that is. And remember, a thermonuclear blast duplicates what happens on the sun. So there could be temperatures in excess of $5,000. $5,000 of only is a dollar, 5,000 degrees, and it would incinerate everything in its scope within seconds. So it's a pretty frightening thought. Now, I mentioned in the article signs of conflict. I'm not going to go over those in detail, but the thing I'll just highlight the different topics. A breakdown in diplomacy, arms races accelerate, military alliances, and so on. You can read those. But the thing I want to stress is that right now there is evidence of all those kinds of things happening, and they're happening more frequently and with greater intensity. And so we saw these things for those that, well, I wasn't around for the beginning of either World War I or II, but historically we know that these signs were very evident before both of those conflicts. So there's a lot of reasons there for us to be very extremely concerned. Now, historically, wars will start because some nation senses they've got an advantage over their enemy and may start it. But they can also start almost by accident. And for both World Wars I and II, they were triggered by what could be regarded as fairly incidental events. And the point I'm trying to make is that there are trigger points or incidents that could provoke a nuclear weapons race. And I give an example in the article. Now, I picked the Senkaku Islands, and that's a string of islands that goes from Japan and extends down to Taiwan. And nobody ever heard of those islands, but they became important in the 1970s when they discovered there's oil and natural gas on those. And both China and Taiwan are laying claim to those, but they're presently under the control of Japan. Now, I'm going to skip over that one. It's described in some detail in the article, but I got really pressed for time because I don't want to stretch this out too long. But I'll just mention one thing that happened very recently that adds to that potential danger. Just within the last month, Taiwan negotiated the largest contract ever in military history. And the United States sold them $15 billion worth of weapons. So you see the armaments are there, the intent is there, and so on. So I was really just giving this as an example of a flashpoint for war. If I'd written this article a bit later, I might have chosen Iran or even Greenland, to just, though that's a little bit less likely, but possible. Then I want to talk about the doomsday clock. The doomsday clock was devised by the Organization of Atomic Scientists back shortly after the war. And they were anxious to produce something that would give a visible image to people about the risk of war. And in the 50s, they set it at 2 minutes to midnight. In other words, 2 minutes to doomsday. And over the years, it sort of stayed at that level. When the Russian USSR dissolved in 1991, it was moved back to 15 minutes to midnight. But about 10 years ago, it was moved up to 90 seconds to midnight. Now, they reset the clock every January, and it was set just a few weeks ago, and they set it back to 85 seconds to midnight. Now, just think about this. This is a group of very knowledgeable atomic scientists who are very conscious of the extreme danger of atomic warfare. And this is the assessment they are making of the danger. And yet, what's happening? The world seems to be unfazed by this, almost neglecting it, or say, whatever. So why is there this public indifference? And I think a part of the answer is in the fact that MAD occurred. Now, I think everyone here probably knows what MAD is, but let me just, for those that need a reminder, you've got to think about two nations that are equally armed. And if one of them attacks and the other counterattacks, then there's complete destruction. So MAD is mutually assured destruction. Now, this is one of the amazing things of history of military efforts. There never before has been a time in history where nations had a supreme kind of weapon and didn't use it for a period of 80 years. And so the point I'm making is that fact that this has helped to maintain peace because the nations have been kind of careful not to incite the enemy to the point where they'd blow up and take drastic action. But there's always the danger that that could happen either through intention or by accident. Now, most people here might remember about the distant early warning system, which is in the Arctic area. And there were at least 2 incidents where they were just ready to pull the trigger to launch nuclear weapons. And in one case, they discovered it was a group of whooping cranes making their way southward, but they looked like incoming aircraft on their computers. And they just fortunately were discovered that before it happened. The other incident had something to do with a queer cloud formation. I forgot the detail. But the point is that there's greater danger of war by accident or by design. And the point I want to get at here is that I believe that putting our faith in MAD is madness. It's naivety. It's denial. And right now we've got 9 nations that have nuclear weapons, and they all have thermonuclear as well. And 2 of those nations are governed by people that are mentally unstable. And of course, I'm thinking about Trump and the ruler of North Korea. But on top of that, there are other dangers. You know the word apocalyptic. I never studied the Bible, so that's a strange word to me. But anyway, there are apocalyptic, boy, that's a real handle. But anyway, during the Bush administration, there were several people in his government that really believed that these were end times, the end of the world. And you just have to think, in the rank of military, see people that are manning these weapons, there are going to be some people with that turn of mind. And if there is a crisis, they're the kind of thing, well, what the hell? The world's going to end sometimes, let's just do it, kind of. There's just total insanity, but that is a real danger to add fuel to this fire. And I mentioned there are 9 countries now with nuclear weapons. And here's a rather frightening point, because there are another 40 countries that have been working with nuclear energy, and they have all the skills to build nuclear bombs. And some of those countries are thinking, well, maybe we should go ahead for self-defense. In particular, South Korea is showing some signs that they want to move in that direction. Now, in the article, I gave a bit of a history of peace movements. But tonight, I just want to focus on the post-war movements. Now, it's interesting. Shortly after World War II, there was a movement to ban the bomb. And interestingly, it was the scientists that created the bomb that led that movement. They realized just what they'd unleashed in the world, this horribly destructive power. And they were anxious to try to ban that. Now, it's interesting. In 1950, there was a conference to ban the bomb in Stockholm. And it was well attended by representatives from every nation. But the group that was most prominent there were the Russians. And they came with a petition with 100 million signatures. I'd think, my gosh, what's the population of Russia? Well, I checked. Before the war, it was 203 million. After the war, it was reduced to 173. So over half their population were signing a petition, ban the bomb. Now, we might wonder, why Russia? Well, you've got to know Russia suffered terribly during the war. They had between 10 and 12 million soldiers killed and a larger number of civilians. And did you realize they lost more soldiers than all of the rest of the nations put together? All of the Axis powers, all of the allies. So the Russians, if anyone, knew the danger and were anxious to avoid this. But then the main part that I want to talk about is in the 60s to 90s. And how many were involved in peace movements during that period? Well, our church was quite involved, and I was involved myself in a lot of different things. But when there was an incident, like, for example, the Berlin crisis or the Cuban Missile, there would be rallies. And there were dozens of organizations. Project Plowshares was a popular one here in Manitoba. But nationwide and internationally, there were many organizations that were working for peace. And so when there was an incident like the Berlin crisis or whatever, there'd be rallies. Now, I want to give you a bit of a feeling for what it's like to take part in a rally. I want you to imagine that you're part of 1,000 people that have gathered at the legislative building. And you've been listening to different speeches, but now there's a talk going on about the war in Vietnam. And the speaker is telling you about how the US used napalm to destroy Vietnamese villages. And they go on and they tell you about how the US used Agent Orange to defoliate the jungle so they could better get at and kill Viet Cong soldiers. And every night on TV, there was a body count. How many Vietnamese soldiers were killed. It was a terrible illustration of dehumanizing the enemy, so that, if you're going to kill somebody, you've got to have some motivation. Well, the motivation was to almost see them as animals in the forest that should be killed. Now, after the speeches, we turn to song, and the band strikes up. And we get songs like We Shall Overcome, If I Had a Hammer, or Ain't Gonna Study War No More, or some of John Lennon's favorites like Give Peace a Chance, or that beautiful song Imagine. And well, there's one that was a favorite of mine, and in fact I probably knew 6 or 8 verses to this, but it's, last night I had the strangest dream I ever had before. I dreamed the nations all agreed to put an end to war. I dreamed I saw a mighty room. The room was filled with men. The papers they were signing said, we'll never fight again. Now, I'd like you to join with me and sing that song. And remember, you're at a peace rally. And when you're at a peace rally, you sing with vigor and commitment. Are you game? Let's go. Last night I had the strangest dream I ever dreamed before. I dreamed the nations all agreed to put an end to war. I dreamed I saw a mighty room. The room was filled with men. The paper they were signing said, we'll never fight again. Well, I'll tell you, when you came out of a rally like that, you felt inspired. You felt that you were empowered, and so on. It was just, they were really motivational. And when you realize that in every capital city of our country and around the world, there are other people with the same kind of motivation and with the same kind of goals. And you felt in a humble way that you were helping to shape the future of mankind. It was really profound. So in a way, we'll never know the real effect of peace movements. But 2 things stand out in my mind. Most of the treaties that were arranged by the United Nations took place at a time when there were these massive peace movements. Now, whether that was really cause or effect is something we can speculate on. And the second point is, when nations are in conflict, it's difficult for leaders to talk about peace without sounding weak. And so, on the other hand, if there is a strong public movement to say, get off your asses, guys, and get rid of this mad rush towards destruction, and get some diplomacy going and some negotiations and move toward peaceful coexistence. So that becomes a powerful force. I'm motivated to go a little bit further with the peace movement because I'm going to be talking at the end about peace movements. But I mentioned the many organizations. The doctors started up an organization called Physicians for Social Responsibility. And John Weens and I kind of took a lead from that and got an organization educated for social responsibility. We got over 1,000 teachers recruited to that. They worked in teams to produce curricula from kindergarten to grade 12 to talk to students about how you deal with peace and so on. And then I remember we put on a major conference in cooperation with the Doctors for Social Responsibility. One of the guest speakers was Andrei Sakharov. Does anyone remember about Andrei Sakharov? He was the Russian guy who really was responsible for developing the hydrogen bomb. Not a very good credential to start with. But then he became a peace advocate and an advocate for human rights. And he won a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. Well, we had him as a speaker. We had George Ignatieff, the father of Michael Ignatieff, who was a distinguished diplomat and a peacemonger, I was going to say. That was a term that was used in derision. But he was an amazing sort of guy. Then I can remember making a phone call to Coretta King, the wife of Martin Luther King. Now, she was very popular as a speaker, especially for young people. And unfortunately, she said she was really interested in what we were doing, but was unable to come. And then I remember, oh gosh, the name has slipped my mind. But anyway, there were all of these, that conference was just so motivational because you just felt the power of the group. So what I would love to see is some of that spirit and dynamism and force of the peace movement being renewed. Okay, enough said on that. And the peace movements today, and we have a couple of people with us from peace movements, and I don't want to feel I'm sort of belittling in any way the efforts, but they tend to be focused mainly on more local conflicts like Gaza and Ukraine. But there are some national organizations developed, and this is what we need. Now, I want to talk about arms control. At one point in my life, I think I knew every treaty was in existence and the status of it, but that's long since slipped out of my memory, and I see no value in repeating that. But what I'd like you to understand is how peace treaties are formed and the general nature of peace treaties. Now, a peace treaty can derive from an individual nation that's concerned about a particular issue and takes action to organize what might be the essence of a treaty, gets other countries tied in with them, and then they bring it to the United Nations. And if it passes the General Assembly of the United Nations, it becomes a UN-sponsored peace treaty. Now, our own Lloyd Axworthy, that was the route he took in trying to get landmines abolished. Now, unfortunately, that went to the United Nations, and it wasn't supported. But the other source of treaties is often from committees within the United Nations that are studying different aspects of the world situation and coming up with ideas of how peace might be promoted. And this has had some measure of success. Now, I talk about bilateral treaties. Those are treaties that, like the United States and Russia, reached some agreements just between the two of them. Later, those treaties were presented to the United Nations, and the United Nations endorsed them, so they became a United Nation-endorsed treaty. And then we had treaties that were signed by the United Nations. Now, there's a catch in that, because a treaty can be signed by the United Nations, but only the countries that sign the treaty are bound by that treaty. So, for example, after World War II, the countries that had nuclear weapons were anxious to see that other countries didn't get those weapons. So they developed a treaty for nuclear non-proliferation. And countries like India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea did not sign that treaty. So that is the basis on which they have developed their own nuclear strategy, their own nuclear assets. Now, some of the larger nations have been able to stop countries like Libya and Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Now, the first one that got listed there is the Partial Test Ban Treaty. Now, when I reread my paper, I realized I did call it a defense treaty, but I didn't elaborate on that. It has nothing to do with banning missiles. Think about it this way. You've got two countries facing one another. They've got equal weapons. If one attacks, the other one retaliates. What's the word? MAD, mutually assured destruction. But suppose that one country attacks, but this country has a shield, so their weapons can't get through. Then mutually, the MAD phenomena would not work. So this treaty is pretty amazing that they actually reached this treaty, but both the United States and Russia agreed that they would not build defenses for military weapons to enter their territory. And that was really a move to make the world safe for MAD to operate. Now, that treaty was ended by the US in the early 1990s, and you might remember that President Reagan talked about a shield over America. And so they were wanting to build a shield that treaty would prevent them from doing it. Of course, that didn't become a reality, but we know that both in Israel and in Ukraine, they have shields that protect them from a lot of the rockets. Russia also has a shield, but they usually use it mainly around Moscow and around some of their oil fields and where they have larger oil reserves. Now, I want you to look at that list, the next three items. Biological weapons. What that did was to say the nations of the world should not use germ warfare as a technique to gain power. And the next one, environmental modification, that had a lot to do with outer space, and it was kind of far out in speculating how a country might use some method to control the environment of another country and influence that way. Then chemicals weapons convention, that would have, for example, prevented the US from using Agent Orange or using Agent Orange. Now, Saddam Hussein, who's accused of using poison gas or chemical weapons on his people, and Assad from Syria was also accused of the same thing. But by and large, those treaties have been effective. Most of the countries have agreed to them and followed them. Now, look at the part in bold print, and that's the essence of this. And that is that these treaties have sort of developed a moral code for nations to follow. And by and large, as I'm saying, they've tended to do that. Now, treaties no longer in force. The anti-ballistic missile treaty, I talked about that. SALT I, I think I called that a treaty in the paper. It was not a treaty, it was talks. And I put that down because it seemed to me in this day and age, it might be, if you want to move towards some international treaties, it might be good just to get people talking about the insanity of an arms race and to think about what could we do to get away from that. But what the SALT talks did was to create the environment for what was called START I. And START stood for Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. And START I had some degree of success. As a result of that treaty, both the United States and Russia agreed to reduce their long-range missiles by 30%. And these missiles were capped and they were inspected, there was inspection. I remember Ruth and I visited, they called those missile sites, and Ruth and I visited a missile site in Tucson, Arizona, and I still remember there was a cap on it 3 feet thick of cement. And then we got in an elevator and went down, 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 and that missile was 90 feet high, just unbelievable how huge those were. And then we got at the lower level, we got into an office, and that's where the soldiers were that manned that, and there was a phone with a red button on it, and that was a direct line to the president, because they had to have authority from the president to either launch an attack or either an aggression or in response to an attack. Now, it also made provisions for the number of weapons they could have, and it's supposed to be active. It was supposed to be 17, it started off at 1550, but then got increased to 1700. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. Then the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty really was very ineffective. Let me go back a notch. When it comes to the intercontinental ballistic missiles, just remember some of these things as an example of power. that the Titan rocket was the big rocket of that time. It could travel at speeds up to 10,000 to 20,000 miles per hour. Unbelievable speed. And it could carry multiple atomic heads or single heads. And so it had a range of about 6,000 to 8,000 miles. So when you think about that kind of power, think about a shield protecting that. Go back to the idea of the distant early warning system, the message we got, if they sighted missiles coming over the pole, we had 30 minutes to hide under our desks to save ourselves. And of course, in Manitoba, we were very concerned because North Dakota was a major target. And we were concerned, well, some of those rockets might be short of their target and land on Winnipeg. And they might just, whatever they landed, it was going to be totally disastrous. Now, I have to go back to the I'll deal with another one here. I need to go back in one way. For the treaty the START II treaty, it never really got launched. It was approved by the presidents of the United States and Russia, but then their Congress never approved it, nor did the Russian government. But it did have some features that people followed for a while. Now, in the statistics that I gave you on nuclear weapons, it showed there were around 5,000 for each country. But you may have been listening to the news recently when they said that START II ended on February the 5th. Now, START II was revived in 2010 by Obama, and I've forgotten who the president of Russia was. And it had a little bit of initial success in that they agreed to some certification of sharing of information about weapons and some certification of what was happening. But it really never got off the ground. But what I had forgotten about, or maybe didn't know, is that they make a distinction between nuclear weapons that are armed and ready to go versus the ones that are in storage. So what the limitation is, 1,700 missiles ready to fire. And when we were visiting that rocket space in Tucson, they told us it took them 60 seconds to fire a missile. They could do everything they needed to in 60 seconds. So there's that distinction between missiles that are ready to fire versus missiles in storage. Now, a comparison to military strength, I was going to go into a little bit of the difficulties of finding accurate data, but I think that the data that I'm showing here is pretty accurate. The Stockholm reference, it's monitored and I think is pretty accurate. But I don't want to spend a lot of time. You have a copy of this, but I want you just to look at that first line, the military budget. The United States spend $997 billion on arms each year now. And that's, just think of it, that's just a little bit short of $1 trillion. And here's a good measure to remember. The amount that the rest of the world spends on military weapons is just about equal to the amount that the United States spends. If you just take the 4 countries who got it listed there, those total up to just a little over half of the US budget. So in terms of military emphasis, the US is way out ahead, unfortunately. And then I'll just draw your attention to the submarines part there. And you can see that there's some equity in the number of submarines. But here was something that scared the hell out of me. When I was looking at the data on those 1,700 missiles that are activated, I learned that 900 of them, more than 900, are in submarines. And they call them a second strike force. So imagine that rockets or missiles from China or Russia strike mainland US. This is the submarines are roaming the ocean in different places, and they're there to strike a second strike to wipe out the enemy in whatever way they can. So in a way, I think the number. I will say a little bit more about this total picture. Trump was apologizing the other day. He was apologizing to his allies who said, you know, they order F-35 fighters, and we have to tell them it'll take 5 years to deliver them. Or they're ordering a submarine, it'll take 7 years, and so on. But he said, we're going to fix that. And now they put a massive amounts of effort into mass production of weaponry. And that has a long-range implication, because a country that bases their economy on military production is a pretty difficult economy to change. So that's a danger step. Then another thing that's kind of a comparison, China is really ramping up their production. They're in a catch-up stage. And they are producing destroyers, 1 per year. Now, I don't know what you think of when we talk about a destroyer. I think some people think of those PT boats like John F. Kennedy abandoned in World War II. But a destroyer is a huge vessel, often 150 yards long, and heavily armed exterior to prevent attacks, and armaments galore. In the United States, it takes 5 to 7 years to build a submarine. And so you can see where China is in real rapid catch-up situation. Now, let me just add one other point to that. That could be a sign of danger, because some of the madmen in the Pentagon might say, you know what, they're getting stronger pretty fast, and they're pretty powerful, so let's hit them before they get too strong. And that kind of thinking, in my mind, isn't beyond what you can find coming out of the Pentagon. So it's a rather scary scene. Then I didn't include this chart in the paper, but I got curious about those 750 bases. Where in the hell are they? And I was shocked when I saw the detail. 120 of them in Japan. I thought, where do they find the room for them? It's a small country. Or then to go in the Southeast Asia country area, South Korea, another 73. So is it any wonder? And I could add that the United States has military alliances with 27 countries in that area. Is it any wonder that China would feel threatened and encircled and feel a need to defend themselves? But there were some place I couldn't get the figures on personnel. But look at that bottom line. 173,000 American soldiers in 159 bases around the country. Now think of it. There are only 193 nations in the world. So think about how the fingers of American economic and military imperialism are penetrating every part of the world. It's a pretty frightening scene, at least in my mind. Now, I did make an effort to sort of compare this, and I think those conclusions are fairly obvious. The U.S. is obviously way ahead in almost every area. Russia has a massive nuclear arsenal, large ground forces, and a lot of tanks and so on. But China is in a rapid state of modernization. Now, the thing that surprised me most as I studied those figures was to find out how inadequately Britain and the European Union are in terms of their status. And their leaders are recognizing that now, and they have real doubt about their ability to oh, yeah. No, I should just hit S, it'll do it. What's happening here? Oh, thank you. Okay, I want to switch now to sorry folks, this is going on too long. How are you doing? Are you dozing? Okay. I want to try to get a handle on these nations, just to get an overall picture of them. And I'm going to talk about spheres of influence. And there's nothing original in my using that. It's a concept many people use. So we don't need to spend too much time in the U.S. We've heard a lot about the Monroe Doctrine from 1823, when the President Monroe said to the European countries, North America is no longer an area for colonization. In 1903, Theodore Roosevelt extended that idea to say that South America was not an area for European intrusion. And then during the Cold War, the United States extended even further and said that American interests anywhere that were threatened by another country was a violation of the United States. So, for example, if a country decided to nationalize an industry that was owned by the United States or companies in the US would come to their defense in a military way if necessary, unless they were adequately compensated. So this is really wielding economic power. Then it's important to realize that at the end of World War II, the United States was the only superpower. They just dominated everything. Russia didn't get an atomic bomb until 1957, and Russia and China didn't get one until just 1947 was when Russia got the bomb, and China didn't get one until 1966 or something like that. So they were behind. So then the bases we've talked about. Now, intervention in foreign affairs. In the article, I talked about a study by University of Boston of American interventions. And they went right back to 1789. And they documented 500 interventions of the United States and other countries. And 60% of those incidents had occurred after World War II. So, and we've seen the signs, of course, just in the last few weeks with their invasion of Venezuela, sorry, and also with the way they're talking about Greenland. So, but the other thing that's important here is to kind of get a handle on this American mentality, that they are the ones that defend freedom. They are the ones that have democracy. They are the ones that have the economic system that's the best in the world. And then on top of that, they believe it's almost like it's a God-given right, but they believe that they have the right to impose this on the rest of the world, and unfortunately, they're doing it, and with some degree of success. Now, I want to turn to Russia. And I talked already about how devastating World War II was for them. But you've got to remember, Russia came out of the Communist Revolution in 1919. So they didn't have much time before World War II to really build up their country. And so, but by the time the war ended, they did have a large army, and they had developed some capacity for building weapons. But basically, they were in a very weakened position. Now, there was a decision made at the conference in Yalta in 1945 by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. And that was, in long range, a kind of unfortunate decision. But they decided that whatever country liberated a country in Europe could basically control that country. So this meant that Russia got influence over the whole of Central Europe, plus Eastern Germany. And they quickly established measures. They established communist governments in all of those countries. They were bound together by the Warsaw Pact. And to different degrees, Russia either influenced or controlled those countries. And then when the USSR collapsed in 1991, interestingly, both Gorbachev and Yeltsin thought this was a good thing, that these countries in Central Europe would become independent countries, they'd become democratic, they'd be trading with Western Europe and with Russia, and they saw kind of a peaceful world emerging. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. But then when the USSR dissolved in 91, then these countries established different forms of government, and many of them, over about a 10 or 15-year period, most of them joined NATO. Now, Clinton bears some responsibility for this, because he was the one in his first presidency who said Europe would be a much better place if all of these countries were united in NATO. And that's what happened. Over a period of time, they all joined NATO, except for the Ukraine. And so you've got to consider the position of a country that's feeling they're surrounded. And there was a definite change. Well, let me say one thing before going to that. Do you remember how Putin was greeted by the Western world when he first became president? They thought he was a real hero. He came to the United States, spoke to the Congress there. President Bush took him to his ranch. And do you remember Bush's famous statement? He said, I looked into his eyes, and I saw his soul, and I saw the soul of an honest man. and then he was very popular in Europe as well. He spoke at the Bundestag in Germany, and there was even some conversation about Russia joining NATO. So it was kind of rosy there. But then the situation changed in 2008. You can mark that on a calendar if you want, because at that point there's more evidence that Central Europe was becoming armed and being very linked with NATO, and Russia started to feel sort of suppressed and encircled. And of course, then when it came to Ukraine, you've got to think all the Central European countries are covering their western front, and then Ukraine would cover part of their southern front. So one interpretation is that Putin could not stand the idea of Russia totally being encircled in this way. Some would say that he was obsessed with restoring the Russian Empire. I'm not sure what the right story is there, but I think the need of a country to feel security is pretty powerful. And I don't think the West recognized how insecure Russia was feeling. Now, so their core concern is security through sphere of influence. Now, I want to talk about China. And I want to spend a little more time on China because I think most of us have very little knowledge about China. At least I'd say that for myself. I remember teaching a course on world history, and I'm sure we spent all of 2 weeks on all of Asia. So that kind of represents the amount of attention it got. But I want to just point to a few periods in history that had a big influence on China. The 19th century is regarded as a century of humiliation. During that century, China was dominated by 5 countries in Europe. In the article I prepared, I noted a sign that Ruth and I saw on the Bund in Shanghai, and it said, no dogs or Chinese allowed. And that was a remnant from British occupation of China. So that was a year of humiliation, a century of humiliation, I should say. Then Japan militarized very rapidly after about 1850. And in 1894, they attacked China, a totally aggressive action. And in 1895, that war ended, and Russia and China had to give up both Taiwan and that string of islands that I was pointing to. And then we've got to remember, in 1911, Sun Yat-sen started to work in a nationalist kind of party, which was picked up by called the Kuomintang, and Chiang Kai-shek ended up leading that group. And at the same time, the Communist Party was developed. So for many years, almost for 2 decades, there was conflict between those 2 groups. And then in 1931, the second Russo-Sino-Japanese War took place. And this was another case of absolute Japanese aggression. And it wasn't until I started to study this that I really realized how severe that was. I remembered from studying history that there was a state on the northeastern part of China called Manchuria. And the Japanese seized that. They renamed it Manchukuo and claimed it was part of Japan. But then they dominated every port city of China. They controlled cities like Beijing and Shanghai. So the control of China by the Japanese was just horrendous. Now here's a catch though. They invaded them in 1931. In 1931, the League of Nations was in operation. And China appealed to the League of Nations for assistance. And they were ignored, totally ignored. Not only that, but some, what should I call them, politicians said, that's kind of a good thing. Let those Orientals kill one another, and then we'll get rid of a lot of nasty commies and the world will be better for that. And that kind of word got back to China. So can you imagine the bitterness that's in the heart of many Chinese as they look back at a century of humiliation? They look back at the situation with the Japanese invasion of China. But the end of World War II was not the end of problems for China, because then the conflict between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party blazed into a civil war. And that raged for 4 years. So it was until 1949 that China was sort of at peace. Now, try and picture the situation in China. They had a population of 550 million. Most of the population were peasants, poorly educated, and desperately poor. And this was what the Communist Party inherited as a nation to try and build. Now, they had what I think is rather amazing success in that building. I remember in our first visit to China, I talked to people about this, and they talked about how certain things became a mark of their progress. And I don't remember the exact sequence of this, but I remember some of the things they mentioned. One of the first things was, we have extra blankets, fundamental. Next, we got a bicycle, gave us some transportation. Got a refrigerator, gave us a place to store food so we didn't have to go shopping every day. Went on to getting a sewing machine. We could sew our own clothes, and on to a TV and a car as the prime level of progress. But it wasn't until 1980 that China really opened up with the Chinese ruler, slipped my mind, doesn't matter. But that was when China opened up to the world. And here's the amazing thing. In about a 20-year period, China became like the warehouse for the world. They supplied almost every product. And then around that time, the Chinese started to develop some goals. And part of it was to reduce the American presence, to strengthen the military, and to extend Chinese influence. Now, I want to give you a bit of an idea of how they extended that influence. Just recently, within the last year, they opened a railway from China to Europe. The Europeans tried to do that for a century and a half without success. They built BRICS, which stands for Britain, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And that is to build a new currency system using the yen as a basis for the currency rather than the American dollar. And you can see where other nations have joined in that. So right now, half the world population is switched to the yen as a method of communication. In addition to that, this organization is trying to change some international organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank, because they're very much based on American superiority. So they have been helping other countries by building roads and railways and infrastructure. And people will say, oh yes, but they build this, and then when they can't pay the bill, they take them over. Well, that's garbage. I read a study about 24 countries in Africa where they'd failed to pay their debts to China. In every case, the debt was renegotiated, usually at a lower rate of interest. But here was the other interesting part of that. When they took a closer look at this, they found that these countries owed twice as much money to European and Western countries. And then on top of that, the interest rate was always higher, and in some cases twice as high. So who's ripping who off? It's kind of interesting to think about. So I'm building this up a bit because I think we tend to have a negative attitude to China. And personally, I was delighted to see what Carney did there. And if we can build more in the way of friendship with them, I think that'll be a major thing towards peace. So then what we end up, we've got a multipolar world, power centered in three areas: Russia, China, and the United States. And there are other countries on the fringe that also want to get into the act, like India and Brazil. But it's in a unipolar world, a world that's totally dominated by the United States. So one of the big issues is going to be how do you build a tolerance to see three different sources of power. Now, I summarize some key ideas that I think come out of this, and I've listed those on your paper so you can look them over. Now, I was going to have a little act here, but I think I've run over my time 10 minutes longer than I wanted to speak, so we'll stop now. And what I'm going to suggest to Wadud is that we have our break at about 8:15, and that we break into groups right now. How many? Well, why don't you just break into triads? Just make small groups of 3, and on the sheet they've handed out, there are some questions that'll get you to get involved in some discussion on that.
Let me do the announcement.
Yeah. Shannon, can I just have your attention, please? Shannon's going to make a little announcement here.
Yeah, and then it's snack time, but I thought some people might be heading away, so I'll just mention this quickly. We do have a couple of guests from the Peace Alliance of Winnipeg, Marianne Sorelli, or did you guys want to just stay incognito? I don't know, Ivan Pankratz. And I just have started to learn about this organization recently, and can you hear okay? And I am so blown away by all the work that they are doing in so many different facets, in such mindful ways. Again, I know so little, but it's a big organization, and we are going to have a chance to hear more about that. On Sunday the 22nd, we're going to have the chair of the organization come to the church after the service at noon. It's Glenn Michalchuk, and he's going to talk about current events, the world as it stands in the world, what the Peace Alliance is doing, what they're focused on, and the lens that they're looking at it through, and also look at some things that we can do to better educate ourselves and to take action. And my little secret hope is that there will be a community of Unitarians come from that are interested in furthering these things and getting out for more action. So the other thing is that if you want during break to chat with any of these folks who have this interesting perspective, it's one of hope, and that would be helpful. Also, because I've only learned about these things a couple of days ago, I can't help but spreading the word. Out in the back there's a table, and it tells you about a protest, a rally going on in support of the people in Minneapolis, and that is this Sunday at 1 o'clock at the U.S. Consulate. And also, some of you might be aware that that the city is moving to try to vote in the ban on nuisance protests. Excuse me, that there's a genocide, and that's going to be a nuisance protest. I think there'd be a lot of people who are concerned about that, and there's a little bit of information out there. If you're wanting to get more information, put your email down and I will share with you what I've been getting from the Peace Alliance. Pardon? The Alliance? Marianne Sorelli and Ivan Pankratz. And the fellow's coming on the 22nd is Glenn Michalchuk. So save that date. That's going to be super. And give us some hope for all this information we're getting here.
Yes, and I want to say a special thanks to the folks from here, from the Peace Alliance that are here. But can I suggest, I don't want you to miss the punchline here as we talk about what can we do to deal with this. So could I suggest that you grab a cup of coffee and come back to where you're seated now. I think my presentation on the last part will be a little bit shorter. At least I'm going to make it shorter so that we have a bit of time for discussion. So grab a cup of coffee or whatever and come back to your seats if you wouldn't mind. Okay, I had intended to wrap up the first session with having three people from the audience to play roles of Xi Jinping, Putin, and Trump. And last year was an important year in world history because that was the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. And it's kind of interesting to see what the different leaders said. So just to summarize briefly, Trump was saying, well, we never got the proper recognition of the part that America played in winning that war. And yes, they helped, but not very much. It's just so arrogant and all the rest of it. And then Putin was a little bit more reserved, and he commented about the help the Allies had given and so on. But I have on the screen there some of the words from Xi Jinping, and I'll read them in case you have trouble. So he's talking about the anniversary of World War II. We have to eliminate the root causes of war. Common security requires nations to treat one another as equals. Nations must live in harmony. Oh, sorry. I'll repeat that last one. Nations must live in harmony and mutually support one another. A vision for the future where humanity can peacefully share a more just, equitable, and prosperous world. That is what he's sharing. The world needs justice, not hegemonism. The UN Charter enshrines sovereignty, equality, non-interference, and peaceful settlement of disputes. A little bit more noble kind of treatment of the topic. But anyway, I want to go on and talk about what do we do about this mess. And I thought we could sort it into two areas. From a political standpoint, how can we respond as a nation? And then secondly, how can we respond in a more personal way? And part of that is based on the idea, how do you keep your sanity in a time of insanity? So then when we look at, from a national point of view, it'd be pretentious to say there's any big solution we can talk about, but I think we have to promote more national and international peace movements. Now, Shannon was helping to fill in the gap a little bit about the tremendous work that's being done right now. But the thing that's hitting me is we're still not getting television and newspaper reports and so on the goals of the peace movement. And that's the kind of thing that I hope will happen. Then I mentioned in the paper the idea of establishing a Department of Peace in the federal government. And I'm suggesting it could have a mandate to encourage and support local peace efforts and to work with other middle-range nations and the United Nations to stop the arms race and seek peaceful coexistence. Now, I did note in the paper that Carney has gained a fair amount of national respect, and that I thought he would be able to kind of play a leadership role. But I'll tell you, since his talk in Davos, I guess I should say, he's become an international figure. Our son Warren is in Germany, and he just talked about how people are raving about his intelligence, his calmness, and the sensibility of what he's suggesting. But he's making a big appeal to the middle nations getting together. And I think that's a hope for peace. If the middle nations get together, they suddenly become a force, a sphere of influence that could have, hopefully, some things. And that's what the last point I was making, build on Carney's international status. Now, in the paper I said, I had this kind of nagging feeling that at the age of 95, I must surely have learned something that would help in a situation like that. And I had to rack my brain a bit to try and come up with something, because I felt as much of a loss about this as anyone. But the one word that did come to my mind is perspective. And in the paper I note how I was 15 when the war ended. And I talked about how it was easy for me to hate Hitler and Mussolini and Hirohito. And then as we knew that whole nations were behind these leaders, it was easy to carry that feeling over to those nations as a whole. And I think it took me 2 generations where I really got to feel that I could accept Japan and Germany as part of the family of nations. So the message I want to convey is that countries aren't permanent enemies, and unfortunately we're learning they're not also permanent friends. But there's a lot we can learn from history that gives you perspective on this. And I just thought about how, for example, Britain and France fought one another for 2 centuries. And then they united together to be allies in World War II, in World War I and II, and they've become keen supporters of one another. I think just of the European situation, those countries fought one another for 1,000 years. And yet in the last 50, 70 years, they've become the European Union, and a lot of those, it's amazing how much of smoldering of bad feelings there are, but they've become a unified group. So I think there's an important message there that we have to look into the future, and we have to see that things change. Putin isn't always going to be the leader of Russia, just as Trump isn't going to always be the leader of the United States. And I think that there is hope for change there. Another perspective, well, that's the point I was making there, how enemies change. Now, one of the things that I think my old age, if I could put it that way, has given me is a kind of a feeling for the flow of history. and how change does take place. It was only 250 years ago that people suddenly thought there's something wrong with slavery. It's not a way to treat other people. And it took 2 centuries after those ideas started to circulate for slavery to be abolished in the United States. And but we've seen change taking place, but the progress is slow, but it's real. I can think of human rights in particular. My gosh, when I was a kid, there was no talk about human rights, and people were very indiscriminate in their nasty comments about other races and so on. And my goodness, in my own lifetime, I've seen this enormous change in our ideas about human rights. And someone like Caitlin and Shannon would know about this from the legal standpoint, because now it's a major part of legal jurisdictions. And then, so the main point I want to make is that progress is slow but real. Then keeping the goal in view. Now, I made the little analogy that I kind of always liked, but I'll repeat it here. And it said, when you're up to your ass in alligators, it's hard to remember that your job was to drain the swamp. Well, when you're up to your ears in propaganda and news about aggression and different kinds of behavior, it's hard to keep in mind that what we really want is to have peace and some order and some discipline and some cooperation amongst nations. And then I think we need to keep our goal in view, but the real goal is arms reduction and peace treaties. And then we have to reflect on Canada's role. And Canada developed, especially during Pearson's age, and it carried forward for a couple of decades. Canada became known as the honest broker, the country that could be depended on to give wise judgments and fairness in dealing with other countries. So we had a real peace leadership role, and I think that's something that could be restored if we were able to move towards a peace department. And I think that would make a great contrast. While Trump is establishing the Department of War, we can have our pride in saying we're interested in a Department of Peace. Then to humanize the enemy. Now, I'm sickened by some of the things that are happening. Somebody made reference to this. Who on earth gives the people the right to blow people out of the water? And this seems to be just like for Trump to say, we've destroyed however many boats it is and just blow them out of the water. There's no assurance that they indeed were drug smugglers. And even if they were drug smugglers, our basic ideas of justice are that there's evidence and they're tried and then punishment. But actions take place, and if people don't rebel against it, those actions confirm behavior. So I think what Trump is doing with things like blowing up ships in the water is just hardening people to the essence of humanity. And I think the same, and I make a reference to the use of drones and planes at high altitude. And I'm going to repeat what I said in the paper. I said when the Islamic group were beheading people for punishment, we were appalled. Terrible, this is barbarian, and so on. But yet at the same time, the US was sending planes at 40,000 feet, dropping bombs which just didn't remove heads, but totally dismembered bodies. But somehow that's collateral damage and that's just part of war. So I think we have to keep the idea of humanity center in our thinking and not get swayed by the kinds of attitudes that ignore that. And then vision before action. There's a phrase that I always liked, although it's certainly not original with me, but you must visualize before you can actualize. I can think of a home front with Ruth, and I'd be going to build something, and she'd say, well, I don't see you working on that. I said, but I am working on it. I'm building a picture in my mind. Every piece is going to fit together and all the rest of it. So you have to visualize before you can make things real. And I think we have to visualize our ideas of peace and our ideas of security and our ideas of interrelationships with other countries. Peace requires imagination, is what I conclude. Then reclaiming humanity. I've kind of dealt with that already, I think. But I think that's a really important point. Now, for a final reflection, I was going to read the last paragraph of my paper, but it's hidden in that speaker's notes part that didn't appear on my screen. So I'll just kind of capsulize what I was saying in that, if I can remember it. But the point I was trying to make is that these difficult times that we're living in leave an awful lot of confusion, bewilderment, disappointment, frustration, all those kinds of emotions. And in a way, that's exactly what Alvin Toffler talked about in his book, Future Shock. And what he said, in essence, was when the world gets too difficult for us to cope with, then we reframe the world. We make it to something that will fit. So we center our living around family, around games, around diversions of one kind or another, and that becomes life. And I'll tell you, I'm seeing so much of that. I'm living in a retirement home now, and can I say it sickens me? It causes me mild disappointment, shall I say, when I find people, they seem to be just waiting to die. What a hell of an attitude. And then when I try to talk about some issues, oh, that's too complicated. Oh, I can't be bothered with that. And it's frightening. So in a way, what I'm saying is that I think it's far better when we're facing a crisis to try to understand it, to try to see how we can cope with it mentally in making sense out of our own lives, and how we can act to change the world in some way. So thank you for listening. And we still have 15 minutes, so I suggest that we move back into your groups, and there's a couple of questions that relate to this last part. So why don't you do that, and we'll try and get out of here at 9 o'clock promptly. Okay?